Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We are opening this international webinar on cooperativism, self-management, and decentralized development. Dr. Sabu Thomas, the Vice Chancellor of Mahatma Gandhi University, Kerala, will chair this inaugural session. Over to Dr. Sabu Thomas. Please unmute and start.
I welcome you all to the inaugural function of the International Webinar on Cooperativism, Self-Management, and Decentralized Development. I welcome all the delegates, and I request Dr. Joy Ellerman to welcome the delegates.
As I started, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the participants who are viewing this from various parts of the globe. This is the international webinar on cooperativism, self-management, and decentralized development, organized jointly by the Mahatma Gandhi University and Kerala Institute of Local Administration, KILA. And this will be there for the next 4 days, every day from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. the Indian time. And it will be available on the KILA Facebook page and the YouTube pages. See, now we are in the midst of a pandemic, and we also know that how different states and regimes and countries have reacted to it and took steps to protect its people. But it all depends upon the type of the state and the regime, need not be the wealth or the per capita income and all kinds of things. And another thing which has evolved is that the decentralized government structures in partnership with the civil society have performed better. But of course, the extent of inequality is a real factor affecting the entire pandemic in a different way. Today, this is the inaugural session where we have Dr. Thomas Isaac, the Minister for Finance and Kerala, who has been the crusader and leader for the initiating the People's Plan campaign of Kerala in 1996. We also have Dr. Patrick Heller, the Lincross Professor of Social Sciences from the Watson Institute of International Studies and Public Affairs, who is a close friend of Kerala, especially starting with his studies on labor in Kerala to finally study on People's Plan campaign itself. He will actually deliver the keynote address. Dr. Sabu Thomas, a well-known, internationally reputed scientist, who is now the Vice Chancellor of Mahatma Gandhi University, will preside over this inaugural function. And Dr. Joe Taramangalam, the Professor and Iyengali Chair of Social Transformation at the Mahatma Gandhi University, will provide the introductory remarks. I, on behalf of Mahatma Gandhi University and Kerala Institute of Local Administration, welcome all of them to this inaugural function. This session will be followed by the first technical session on decentralized governance and development in comparative perspective, where we have Professor Ole Tornquist, again a close friend of Kerala, who has been closely following Kerala development, who is the Professor of Political Science and Development Research at the University of Oslo, who will actually chair the first technical session. Srimati Sharda Muralidharan, IAS, the Principal Secretary of the Department of Local Self-Governments, Kerala, and who has been again another crusader for decentralized development and governance. And Ahmad Tariq Rashid, the Program Director of the IDRC, the International Development Research Center in Canada, will speak during that session. Welcome all of you to this session. Finally, on behalf of the organizers, I welcome all of you who are watching from across the globe, all of you to this inaugural session, as well as the ensuing technical sessions over the next 4 days. Welcome all of you. Thank you. And over to Dr. Sabu Thomas.
Dr. Thomas Isaac, Minister of Finance and Choir, Government of Kerala, our keynote speaker, Dr. Patrick Heller, Landcross Professor of Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology and International Studies at University and Director of the International Research Program, Watson Institute of International Studies and Public Affairs, Professor Joseph Tharamangalam, Professor Ayangali Chair of Social Transformation of Mahatma Gandhi University, my own parent university in Kottayam, Professor Dr. Joy Alaman, Director of Kerala Institute of Local Administration, Thrissur, Kerala, our distinguished speakers, delegates, and friends. Let me first congratulate Dr. Joy Alaman, the Director of KILA, Thrissur, and Professor Joe Tharamangalam, my colleague at the university, for organizing such a joint conference between KILA and Mahatma Gandhi University. And I really like the title of the conference, Cooperativism, Self-Management, and Decentralized Development. Very important topic for the current scenario. I also looked at the topics being discussed in the conference, a wide range of topics: decentralized governance, self-help group, role of NGOs, decentralization, corona, democracy and development, democratic decentralization process, citizenship issues, employment creation, self-management, local self-government, cooperative farmers. So a wide range of topics are covered in this conference, a fantastic meeting. And we have distinguished speakers from different countries. It's truly international, from Oslo, from India, from Canada, from South Africa, from United States, from Mexico. So we have really excellent speakers for the conference. When you look at the theme of the conference, the cooperative movement and decentralization has a lot of importance. If you look at the cooperative movement, they're all people-centered enterprise, jointly organized by the people. And they are democratically controlled by the people. And they have a common socio-economic platform for the development of the country. If you trace the history of cooperative movement, you all will see the International Cooperative Alliance, a very strong alliance in the world, started in sometime in 1895. And if you look at the total globe, we have more than 3 million cooperatives in the world. And I understand that the driving spirit, the energy for all the cooperative movements, the driving principles include equality, social justice, secularism, sustainability, inclusiveness, diversity, accessibility. These are the driving principles of cooperative movements. And again, if you look at the cooperative movement all over the world, you will find that there is a very strong network in cooperative movements. And they work in local level, grassroots level. As Dr. Joy Alaman indicated, COVID has been analyzed very carefully by sociologists, economists. And they analyzed in terms of the type of state regime, irrespective of the GDP or per capita wealth. They analyzed in terms of decentralized governments. They analyzed in terms of inequality. They analyzed in terms of primary health system in a country. And if you look at the Kerala situation, Kerala has been, well accepted, well recognized in controlling the COVID. And I've read the article written by Patrick sometime back in Hindu. He indicated that this is basically because of the decentralized approach, the robust primary health system in Kerala, and great contribution from social capital, civil society. And again, if you look at the global initiative on cooperativism as a result of COVID, you can see that a lot of international cooperation on vaccine development, a lot of international cooperation on joint research. Again, if you look at the American Chemical Society or Royal Society publications, you will see large number of publications jointly made between different laboratories across the globe. My own laboratory, actually, we work very closely with China and United States. And even large number of projects were submitted during COVID time. If you look at the ACS publication, large number of joint projects across the globe were submitted to contain the pandemic, and understanding of the pandemic. And if you look at the European Union, a lot of funding for European Union, to support cooperative research. And if you look at Germany, Germany has taken a lot of initiative to support Spain, to support France, to support Italy. And my own research group, actually, we submitted 6 or 7 research projects. One was DST NSO program with Georgia Tech. Another was with University of Paris. So we submitted 6 or 7 very strong research projects involving 10 laboratories across the globe. So I find that the COVID actually initiated a lot of cooperative movement across the globe. And there are a lot of excellent speakers in this conference. Describing a large number of topics. I request Dr. Joy and Dr. Joe Tharamanga.
Technical snag.
Yeah.
Now I request Dr. Thomas Isaac to deliver the inaugural address.
Respected colleagues and dear friends, when I presented my last budget,
Sound welcome.
can you hear me? Am I clear enough?
Yes. Can you speak a little bit loudly? Dr.
Okay.
Thomas Isaac.
All right. Kerala is going to celebrate 25 years of experience in decentralized planning. Well, we were thinking of celebrating it by bringing together everyone who have been involved in it, particularly those who attended the International Conference on Decentralization in 2000, which made the first assessment of our experience in Kerala. But now it's COVID, and it's not possible to organize such a large seminar. But Kila has been doing, I think, taking initiative for many initiatives to contemplate upon our experience in the last 25 years. Most important is the publication series about 24 books on decentralization. They have planned 2 series to be published by some important publishing houses. And I myself was very surprised to learn that our universities in Kerala have produced more than 24 PhD theses on decentralization. And each of these books is going to be launched with a webinar. So if you add together all the webinars that are going to take place, we would have brought together everyone who have been involved in this program in the state. Now, when Kerala launched the People's Plan campaign in 1996, decentralization was the fashion in the world. In fact, we had sketched a graph of publications worldwide on decentralization, and we find there's an exponential growth from early 1990s, which peaks something around 2000, and then it begins to decline. I think that reflects the worldwide, say, kind of skepticism that is also growing regarding decentralization. Now, if you analyze these studies, majority of them belong to assessment of programs that have been linked to World Bank, USA, IMF programs, and so on. Most of them being introduced by international funding agencies. And if you look at I think hundreds of World Bank supported studies on decentralization, there's a remarkable sense of loss. There are very few success stories to be found. Now, I'm not surprised at all with this outcome, because the kind of themes that are being taken up in this webinar series regarding, say, cooperativism, self-management, and so on and so forth, or radical remaking of the society, they're very foreign to most of these experiments that have taken place. They were by and large part of the structural stabilization, structural adjustment programs of the World Bank and IMF. You know, from the starting with 1970s, when the debt crisis exploded in the third world, there have been a very sharp intervention to stabilize these economies by designing a recession in these countries, and then having a structural adjustment program so that these economies are open to foreign investment. And is part of this social engineering process that decentralization was promoted. And now it's general agreement. If you have anybody has got a doubt, to read Stiglitz, who was then a part of this establishment. Looking back, what happened? When Latin America, 1970s was or 80s was a lost decade. Everywhere in the third world, every indices of development began to decline, and decentralization, unfortunately, got identified with this outcome. Even when the participatory budgeting of Latin America went worldwide, it was a sanitized version shown of all radical dimensions and thinking which got promoted. So there's a sense of disappointment reflected in the decline in the scholarship and studies of decentralization. Now it is in this context the theme that is being discussed in the webinar assumes importance. And Kerala becomes very relevant in this background. One, Kerala, like many other radical experiments in Africa and Latin America, drew inspiration not from the World Bank or structural adjustment programs of globalization, but from the nationalist background. See, it is Gandhi is the ideal of decentralization, Gram Swaraj in India. So the Indian government creates a constitutional framework to move towards greater decentralization in the administration. That framework was utilized by the radical thinking and radical practitioners in Kerala to create, I would say, deepen and widen the democratic process in the state. The democracy which existed at the central and state level was to be brought at the local level. But the local democracy was not to be cloning of the state and central versions, but genuinely a new alternative where people go beyond representation and participate in the decision-making process through as much a deliberative way they can. And that's what People's Planning Campaign was about. And if you compare Kerala with what has happened in Latin America, very well, I must tell you, we in Kerala knew nothing about participatory budgeting. That started in that corner of the world about 5-6 years before Kerala launched this People's Plan campaign. In fact, I encountered participatory budgeting for the first time in Wisconsin with Patrick Hull, John Paul, and so on, in Eric Wallen Wright seminar over there. And I was struck, we are separated by such a long distance, continents, how alike we were thinking. See. Of course, there are certain big differences also. If I was struck, for example, one sharp difference between Kerala experience and Latin American experience is how do you ensure participation of the people? There is a very important field. The people also has to have certain skills, not communication, but technical skills also of planning, say implementing schemes and so on. So unlike in participatory budgeting, the People's Planning Campaign in Kerala was the biggest ever non-formal education campaign anywhere. I mean, about millions of people were being trained for more than one in a year, 6 rounds of cascading training from top to down. Now, what is the impact of this? Now, even after 25 years, every village in Kerala, every town in Kerala is preparing their own local plans. This is what Sandoz speaks about techno-democracy, but techno-democracy would come that we have to really think in terms of empowering people. And this, I think, is one of the significant differences. Second significant difference is in Latin America, participatory budgeting. You involve in the budgeting of certain components, which is very akin to our plan. All infrastructural projects and service projects which are new are part of the planning in Kerala. Okay, since there is no concept of planned budget there, you take the name participatory budgeting. But in participatory budgeting in Latin America, there are only very rare instances where people are encouraged to get involved in implementation through various forums of theirs, beneficiary committees or neighborhood groups and so on. People are, here in Kerala, we were encouraging people to get involved. In fact, our point of departure was the National Planning Commission and so on were encouraging people to participate, but without giving them any role in decision making. And therefore, the People's Planning Campaign was in a way changing it. People were to participate in the decision making, then they were to and we argue they would participate better in the implementation. So there were many differences also of historical antecedents and so on. But I was surprised that Martha Hennerke, reading her, she was seeing the similarities and was seeing the need for integrating these two streams. Her vision of 21st century socialism, the book titled as that. Or later, the recent book, which I think just before death was published by Monthly Review. In fact, there is an explicit attempt to integrate Kerala experience and Latin American experience. I think it is fantastic. It gives a kind of inspiration to visualize the future where what we are doing today would have a role. The post-revolutionary society is not something that is to be built after revolution, but this is something that would grow from the embryonic form, the present society itself. And that future society would be democratic, decentralized, participatory, and therefore the aspirations of radical movements in South Africa, in Latin America, in Kerala, there is so much commonality, and I think there is a lot to learn from the experiences. But this one distinctive feature, I think, of Kerala. In Latin America, with the decline of the radical parties in many of the countries, even in the Porto Alegre, there were reversals going back. Porto Alegre has formally given up participatory budget itself. But Kerala, the decentralized planning, democratic decentralization, has by and large survived 4 government changes. The left and right alternate, as everybody knows, and it has survived. Unlike in the past, where many attempts of left to introduce its decentralization were subverted afterwards. And that's a success of the strategy of conceiving decentralization not as an administrative reform from above, but as a social mobilization process. And that made all the changes. And secondly, the design was to create democratic space. There's no sectarianism in there. Okay, I have some vision of radical democracy, but there may be persons who don't believe in that, who don't share in that, who may have opposite thinking about it. But design of your decentralization would have to be such that it cannot accommodate divergent opinions, space. Then how do you guarantee your political outcome? You taking political initiative in intervening. That's it. So you are political, you are radical, therefore there is a space created for you to intervene. And that's what democratic decentralization does. And it was consciously done. It was consciously done. Quote unquote, we used to call it new development politics. And new development politics is precisely this. If you want, I can quote E.M.S. Namboodiripad on this and so on. You want to read, you read Mathai Manjuvaran Memorial Lecture of E.M.S., you will understand what a new development politics he was referring to. And so far it has survived. And then from the vantage point of 25 years later, when I look back, I feel proud. That is what I want to say of the outcome. It has made life in Kerala a little better. I am not saying it has solved all the problems. Definitely Kerala has moved forward. You want? Take the pandemic today. Why is Kerala able to address it so much better? Because you have a local government at the local level which will bring together everybody, immediately react to an issue. In the flood crisis, in the pandemic crisis, the local government is the center of action. A power structure has come at the local level. Your public health system in 1990s, 2000, 2005, to that period, there was this KSSP survey, family health survey, which shows that only 38% of the population was using the famed Kerala public health system. Now, 2 years back, national survey shows the proportion of population using it has increased to 48%. The infant mortality rate, which embarrassing is rose to 50, has now come down to 7. So I can go on narrating the health indexes. Education is another sector where it was declining. Parallel education system was coming up, public education system was going up, upsetting all of us because Kerala's progressive culture, civic consciousness, this secularism, everything's a contribution. Major contributor has been our public education, where you are, whatever caste you belong to, whatever class you belong to, you have to sit in the common bench, you have to learn the same syllabus, same uniform, same food, transport, and so on. See? And that parallel unaided sector was going up. And do you know what happened in the last 5 years? 5 lakh, 500,000 students. Their parents thought the public education system is, can compare well with the unaided sector. Took transfer certificate of the children from the unaided sector, brought them to their public education systems. And Kerala in the Niti Aayog index of quality of education, we are very upset the quality of education is poor, but still highest in the country. Now, another 500,000 people get houses. We would have solved our housing problem here, except those who may get immiserized. Family partitioning housing problem would have been resolved. 2 million houses built. Total length of roads was 100,000. Now is 200,000 plus. Every house is electrified. It was less than 50%, no, it was less than around 60% when decentralization was introduced. Every house is an open defecation free state. I can go on narrating. Take, for example, reduction in the poverty. Kerala is the state that has the fastest reduction in poverty. Recently, a figure came, which I find it difficult to accept. If you take the quality of life index and UNDP index and see the percentage of poor people is 1% here. I can't believe that. It shows that even people who by income, 12% is the poverty line, poor people by income, even they would have basic needs met. You have a neighborhood group system which provides, you know how much? 10,000 crores of microcredit to poor. These are changes, transformations that have come. In every sector, there has been, and you can see, for example, the health, for example, you must have been stuck. You found that I mentioned the indices of health indices were worsening. Some of our best people have been involved in decentralization, like some of the H Center people did the study and came out with a devastating critique of it after I think of the 10th year of decentralization. So what is happening? Now, decentralization does not mean there is no planning higher levels. It's a multi-level planning that takes place, the principle of subsidiarity. So it means a kind of integration of higher tiers, government and local government. So what happened in the health system was the doctors, as a community, boycotted. They thought it was unbecoming to be implementation officers of local governments. And there was this tension at that level. But after about within a decade, they realized it's much easier to negotiate with the local government than their own departmental bureaucracy. And then began a change, which was facilitated by many health activists, experiments, and so on and so forth, and health got transformed. So now I'm entering the last point. Okay, if outcomes are there, but what about the processes? Now there are many things because this is a process that will determine how much democratic the society is, not just the outcome, physical outcomes. How do you participate? How deliberative is your participation? How transparent is it? And because of increase in transparency, how much corruption comes down? And so on and so forth. Well, I think there are many issues, critical issues related to this. I think the participation has to be qualitatively improved. One has to rethink. Nobody wants to be in a permanent state of agitation here. You may campaign, everybody comes and joins, but you can't endlessly go on like that. So then we have to institutionalize the best of what emerges from campaign. That'd be a problem. The problems created by regime changes that have taken place. I don't want to be critical about it. I would admit that quality of deliberation has to be improved. Participation in Grama Sabha has gone up, have to go up. The corruption is creeping in. There is an element of bureaucratization that is taking place and so on. And the production sectors, it has to improve very much, etc. And I come to this last point here. If you look very self-critically, the cooperatives and decentralization have gone somewhat parallel in Kerala. Though we realize it was happening in the beginning, and I have a special training, I myself wrote a small book on that, quoting Nehru, what is village development, the local cooperative, local school, and local panchayat. That is for him, the mantra for development. But this cooperative is absent, how to bring it back. Now I think stage is being set in Kerala for that. Why didn't happen at that time? We were thinking of making cooperative the banker of the panchayat, local cooperative to the banker. But unfortunately, these cooperatives are not part of the core banking. Therefore, our money transfer system cannot be integrated with that. But now the Kerala Bank has come. Then there is a program to create mirror images of local cooperatives in the Kerala Bank so that they can also participate in the core banking system. And I think the ideal which was once put that our cooperative bank, our cooperative credit cooperative would be the local banker. I think that dream may be realized. a major attempt is being made for overcoming the laggardness, lack of achievement in the production sectors, where I think cooperatives are going to play a very key role, particularly in the agro-processing sectors. In fact, the reason I was slightly late was we were discussing today a program where local government and the cooperatives are going to join together and do something which has never been attempted in India. Have floor price for vegetables. Okay, 14 types of vegetables. Now, these cooperatives have money, therefore they set up local stores and have at the block level certain cold rooms and so on and so forth. Anybody can bring the vegetable. If they get a high price, they can go, but the floor price they will be assured of. And suppose the cooperative fails to sell it at the price and make a loss, local governments would be permitted to subsidize it. This was successfully run in my village, my constituency. So we can just scale it up. So anyway, I think, but self-management, self-help groups and so on, I don't want to take more time. I have only 5 more minutes. I'll stop there. So let me make my final statement. If you look at the scenario in Kerala, what you'll find is exemplary performance. Laggards. Some of them badass. But then I find, even in average or in bad panchayats, there are some projects that are very good. See, I have been attending regularly every week 3 hours with Kila. They have started about already 6 webinars are over, where best practices, good practices are being presented by the panchayats. And it's a great experience. COVID, we don't run around doing functions. Therefore, there is some time to spare. I watch it. That's a start by this fact. They may not be model panchayat, but even bad panchayat, moderate panchayat, there are very good practices. So you search, why? What happened? I asked them, how did you do that? Then you see, there is a volunteer who thinks everything in the world is going to revolve around this little small project, or an officer who is proud of his work and wants to do good, or a representative. 1 or 2 people together, enough, yeah, you can. That is what is called democratic space. That's what democratic decentralization does. It creates a democratic space. So to do something good, you can do. If you are a person with a commitment, vision, a civic consciousness, yesterday you couldn't do. You had to come to Trivandrum, convince a politician over there. Now no more. It's enough. You go to your panchayat president, you go to your Gram Sabha. If you are not able to influence any of them, there would be a self-help group, a neighborhood group, you can intervene. This is what is the essence of expanding the democratic space. And Kerala, I would say, democratic decentralization has expanded the democratic space, and therefore, anybody radical enough to think, visualize something new, something different, there is a space for you to act. I think it's a great achievement. Thank you very much. And I hope, I'm certain, very critical approaches, assessment will be there. And I am certain you are all contributing, even the sharpest critic, contributing to making this process better and better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Isaac, for your inaugural address. We all enjoyed your inaugural address. You successfully demonstrated the success story of Kerala through democratic decentralization process and cooperative movement. And Dr. Isaac also compared Kerala's situation to the rest of other countries. Very good approach. Thank you, Dr. Isaac. Now I call upon Professor Joseph Taramangalam, the professor and Iyengali Chair of Social Transformation, Mahatma Gandhi University, and my colleague. Professor Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sabu. I have actually some notes, but I'll just speak using my notes. I have 5 minutes, and I plan to stick to my 5 minutes. Let me also remind everyone that we have a tight program, and I hope the chairs will also be timekeepers. Anyway, thank you all for accepting our invitation, and thank you the participants, international participants, scholars, and the ones from Kerala and India. Thank you all. These are hard times, unusual times, but you have gone out of way to find time to participate in this, I think, very promising webinar. So let me also wish everybody happy Onam. You know, this is the time Kerala celebrates what I would call a very unusual kind of festival. This is not a celebration of imperial conquest. This is not a celebration of some strongman's doings. This is a celebration of a time and a society where all people are equal. മനുഷ്യരെല്ലാവരും ഒന്നുപോലെ. So I would say that millennia before the French Revolution or the American Constitution, people in India, in Kerala, imagined a society where all men are equal. And they have never forgotten that. Let me move on. I would like to say a word about our goals, how we conceived this webinar. Initially, it was myself and Jose Chatukulam. I don't see him there. Well, he is the director of the Center for Rural Management. In consultation with Sabu, the Vice Chancellor of MG University, who thought about this. And the context was the pandemic and how Kerala dealt with it. People were across the world were celebrating, lauding the Kerala approach. People wrote articles in newspapers. In BBC had a program. Jose and I also wrote a paper and published it in one of the Indian newspapers. So that was the immediate context, but then we said we should now make it a much bigger comparative study. The broader context is that there has been this interest in decentralization and cooperativism for a long time. From the initial stages of the capitalist system, there were all these movements of levelers and various other movements from below. And then after the neoliberal devastation, there were again reactions all over the world, in Latin America, in India, and so on. And then this webinar, this pandemic came. So there's a long history. I won't go into all that. So our idea was to, our goal and our vision was to bring together the best experts in the field from the whole world, representing who are experts in South Africa, Latin America, Brazil, Cuba, and Europe, Sweden, and so on. And I believe we have been fairly successful. And I am anticipating a very productive webinar. Let me say a word or two. The chair, please stop me if I exceed my time. I am conscious of the time. Let me say a word or two about the kinds of topics or kinds of issues we may discuss. Of course, this is all coming up, but since I am not making another presentation, I will just focus on one or two things as regards decentralization. I think one question that should be raised that will come up is the degree of coordination and synergy between the state and sub-state organizations. This is a major issue being discussed. I have participated in probably about 10 international seminars in the past few years on decentralization, on cooperativism, half of those in Cuba. And I have visited cooperatives. So this always comes up. What is the optimal level of coordination? Is there a contradiction? So decentralization can be maybe taken too far, and local government, I believe, I think Ole is going to make a presentation. We will deal with how a great, highly admired country like Sweden was not successful in coping with this pandemic. So that is one issue we want to raise. It's a continuing debate in Cuba, for example, downsizing the state. State property is being redefined to include properties other than state-owned properties, for example, cooperative property, and so on. And another issue that will come up, I think that will come up and that should come up, I think is of great concern, is what happened now?
Sir, you can continue. We are hearing you and seeing you. Don't worry.
Oh, okay. I can't see anybody. What happened? I don't know.
But you can continue. You can continue.
Yeah. Okay. So that issue is inequality and decentralization. In highly inegalitarian societies like India, Brazil, when we have local governance, how does this work within a context where our local elites who control the local system, they are landowners, they have economic and political power, and the tendency is what we call clientelism, clientelist politics. So how do you deal with that? Our great leader in India, Kanshi Ram, called it Chamcha Raj, clientelist regime. And that is a tendency, especially in countries where there are entrenched systems of inequality. And just one more point about cooperatives, something that came up in many of our seminars in Cuba. Is there a contradiction between the concept of cooperative management, shared wealth, shared enterprise, and the imperative to achieve high productivity and efficiency? So when a cooperative becomes successful, there are some examples from Europe, for example, they are so successful, then there is a desire to improve productivity and efficiency, and an imperative to hire efficient professional managers and experts, engineers, etc., which of course creates some inequality. These people are paid higher wages and so on. This is happening to a small extent in Cuba too. So how do you deal with that? I think I'll stop there and just say a final word of thanks to all participants, and remind them that we'll follow up. We will ask you for your final papers which we hope to bring together and publish what we think or hope will be a very interesting and important book. So thank you all, and I stop now.
So thank you, Dr. Joe, for your very interesting introductory remark, and you are the driving spirit for this conference. Now I call upon Dr. Patrick Heller, Watson Institute of International Studies and Public Affairs. Dr. Heller, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. And let me also begin by thanking Joe. I know he put a tremendous amount of work into organizing this extraordinary workshop and bringing this amazing group of people together. And I want to thank all the organizers and Keela and Mahatma Gandhi University. I also want to just say a hello to Ola Tornquist and Stephen Friedman, old friends who are joining us today and will really give this workshop the comparative flavor it needs. And I also want to thank all of those of you who are in Kerala. I've known many of you for many, many years. And, you know, this pandemic, I think, has been really difficult for all of us. But there are extraordinary moments like this where we get to reconnect with old friends and express our gratitude. And in my case, I want to express my gratitude for many, many years, going into decades now of learning from you and learning from the experiences of Kerala and its extraordinary efforts to deepen democracy. And you know, finally, I also want to say that I'm particularly indebted to Thomas Isaac. We've published together, and I'm deeply grateful for his support throughout all the years, and for his introductory comments, which I think really give us a comparative perspective on the process of democratic deepening in Kerala that raises all sorts of really interesting practical but also theoretical questions. So in the time that I have, and I will be very disciplined and my comments on time, I want to talk about COVID, I want to talk about democracy, and I want to talk about decentralization. And I want to mostly try to draw out some initial comparative lessons. The jury is still out. As people have said, this pandemic will be endemic. It's not just the pandemic that we have to deal with, but the longer term welfare consequences, which I think we already realize are extremely serious and will be with us for years, if not decades to come. So it's still early, and yet we're already seeing across nation states and within nation states quite extraordinary variation in terms of the responses to both the pandemic and efforts to address its welfare consequences. So in that respect, this COVID crisis it's a brutal but quite powerful natural experiment. The same external intervention has impacted almost every part of the world. It's impacted parts of the world at different times with different levels of ferocity, but there are very few places in the world now that haven't been impacted by the pandemic. And in many respects, this is becoming a global physical exam of the social body. And I say the social body in two respects. So on the one hand, what the pandemic has done is exposed all of the underlying inequalities and cleavages of modern democratic societies. For those of you who have followed the progression of the pandemic in the United States, you'll know that the CDC has been collecting data on the impact of the pandemic across various social categories. And we now know beyond any doubt that Hispanics and Blacks in America are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from the pandemic than whites are, right? So, and we know that there are deep cleavages along racial and class lines in the United States, but never have they become more transparent than they are now. There's a second sense in which this is a physical exam of the social body, namely the extent to which it both tests and reveals government responsiveness and capacity. And again, not just at the national level, but also at the subnational level. So there's a lot of research we need to do. And I think this workshop is a very first important step in that direction. And so I'm really looking forward to our deliberations over the next few days. Now, in talking about COVID, I think it's important to put it in its specific historical and global context. These are no ordinary times independently of COVID. COVID comes at a time where I think at the global level, we have three intersecting forces that in many ways compound the effects of COVID. So one, of course, is increasing inequality. And sociologists, this is all we ever talk about, inequality. We've been concerned about increasing inequality for a very long time. But now that economists, most notably Thomas Piketty, have recognized that inequality is a problem, it's officially a problem. And we have superb data thanks to Piketty and his team. And we know that across the world, there's increasing income inequality, increasing asset inequality. And as Piketty has shown, and which is really just absolutely stunning, so much of contemporary wealth today is in fact inherited wealth. It's intergenerational wealth that has been passed on from one generation to another, much like it used to be the norm under feudalism. So increasing inequality. There's also increasing uncertainty as to the nature of the new emerging post-industrial economy. We've shifted away, obviously, from manufacturing to services, information and IT-based economies. And the COVID crisis, of course, is accelerating a lot of these tendencies. CEOs all over America say, we have a new work model. People can now work from home, and we can replace more and more workers with artificial intelligence and with other automated techniques. I think the jury's still out, but there's little doubt that this COVID crisis and the lockdowns are at least showing us some possible tendencies in the future and how they might accelerate. The third point of intersection is what I call the age of reaction. Not since the interwar period of the rise of fascism in Europe have we seen so many reactionary movements rear their ugly heads. And across the democratic world, from the Philippines to Hungary, from the UK and the United States with Trumpism to, of course, Bolsonaro and Modi in India, we've seen the rise of new ethno-nationalist reactionary regimes that threaten democratic institutions. We've always had reactionary regimes, we've always had right-wing mobilization, but never since the interwar period have so many democracies, and of course the United States comes first on that list, seen fundamental democratic institutions directly challenged, right? We have a president of the United States who is now very openly saying he will not accept the results of our election on November 3rd if he does not win, which is, of course, the very definition of a move towards authoritarianism. So it's in this context that the COVID crisis erupts. And to make a very, very big generalization that many of you will no doubt question, and I think Ollie will be the first one to question this generalization, and again, recognizing that we're still early in the pandemic and we still have much to learn and much data to collect, I do think there's a clear pattern that has emerged, that on the one hand, what I call embedded democracies, and I'll elaborate on that term in a moment, or if you will, deeper democracies have done relatively well in addressing the pandemic. In Europe, with the exception of Sweden, which Ollie will tell us about, the social democracies, the northern democracies, which also are the more decentralized democracies in Europe, have generally done relatively well, again, both in dealing with the pandemic itself and addressing some of the welfare consequences. And their ability to do so in large part has to do, I believe, with the degree to which they're decentralized. We see that distinction in the United States as well. There's a very clear divide in the United States between red and blue states being Democratic states, red states being Republican states, and I'll return to this in a moment, but generally speaking, the blue states, the Democratic states, Democratic Party states have been more responsive to the pandemic. I would then contrast those cases with the 5 countries in the world that have the highest absolute incidence of infections and deaths. They are all, one of them, Putin's Russia, of course, is an autocracy, but the other 4, the United States, Brazil, and South Africa is now on the list, and Stephen Friedman will speak to the South African case, so I will bracket the case of South Africa. But Modi and Bolsonaro and Trump have in common the fact that they are all democratic autocrats, democratically elected in democratic systems, but governing very much as autocrats. And I think across the board, there's a very wide recognition that these 3, Bolsonaro, Trump, and Modi, have probably had the worst responses to the pandemic. In some ways, India's response is a little bit better in per capita terms, et cetera, and at least some of the early policies made some public, et cetera. But there's been a very broad failure in India, with the exception of some states, including Kerala, to address the welfare consequences of the pandemic. The United States and Brazil are well on the way to having the highest per capita death rates in the world. And we're all familiar with the degree to which Bolsonaro and Trump have completely abdicated responsibility in dealing with the pandemic. So let me break this down a little bit and talk briefly about the autocratic responses, then contrast them with the democratic responses, and then try to draw out some comparative and analytical lessons about democracy and decentralization. I should begin with a footnote, and the footnote is East Asia. And East Asia doesn't get much coverage in these kind of comparative conversations. And yet the East Asian states have probably, in just sort of pure raw numbers of infections and deaths per capita, et cetera, had the most successful responses in the world. And of course, what East Asia has in common, at least as we understand it in the comparative literature on development, is the so-called developmental state, right? So South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore to a lesser extent, have all had very effective responses to the pandemic, have also dealt with the welfare consequences relatively well. China's a bit of a tricky case in that its initial response was terrible. And then obviously with the kind of authoritarian powers it was able to impose a very strict lockdown. And now I think Beijing hasn't had any cases in weeks, which is quite extraordinary. So I want to make that a footnote because, of course, some of the East Asian developmental states, South Korea and Taiwan, are now democratic, and that has played a role in this story. On the other hand, there's a long history, a 2,000-year-old history of building up state capacity in East Asia. And we also have to contend with the fact that many of those regimes remain quite authoritarian. But one could look to a China, or one could look to a Vietnam and say, well, authoritarianism, insofar as it concentrates power in the executive, gives a state a lot of tools to deal with a crisis such as the pandemic. But bracketing those cases and talking about authoritarian tendencies in the democratic world, what we see, of course, and here I have Modi, Bolsonaro, and Trump particularly in mind, are right-wing populist rulers who, like all populist rulers, don't have much patience for the institutions of democracy and don't have much patience for civil society. And they have very little patience in the institutions of democracy and in an independent civil society, because almost by definition, autocrats and populists see themselves as the people incarnate, right? They are the people, and at least in these 3 cases, they were indeed elected. And they see themselves as personifying the will of the people in classic populist fashion. And all 3 have worked incredibly hard to centralize power, to centralize authority. And again, this could, in principle, have given them the resources to deal with this crisis. And yet we see quite the opposite. And we see quite the opposite, of course, because dealing with a crisis of this nature requires working with institutions, and it requires working with civil society. So let me unpack these 2 dimensions of the complexity of any modern democracy. And I'll use here the example of Trump, since it's obviously gotten a lot of attention, and I'm sure you're familiar with the broad outlines of what's happened in the United States. But the response in the United States, of course, begins with Trump's own hostility towards independent institutions, including the institutions of what he calls the deep state, including the CDC, including the scientific and professional establishments. And so there's been very little effort on the part of the White House to actually coordinate with public health professionals and other institutions that would have to play a role in addressing the COVID crisis. There's been very little capacity to coordinate across agencies and across the different levels of government, again, because Trump fundamentally distrusts all of these institutions and refuses to devolve real authority to them. So there's been very little effective coordination across the different federal agencies. And then, of course, there's been open hostility to governors who are not aligned with Donald Trump's political party. So while he has encouraged and supported Florida and Texas and other Republican-controlled states, he's had an attitude of open hostility towards Democratic governors. I think the response of these autocrats has also been catastrophic, in part because these are exclusionary regimes. These are all regimes that were built on the support of a primary, highly essentialized identity. Whites in the United States, basically a coalition of whites in Brazil as well, and of course the forces of Hindutva in India. And the building of these core bases, of course, comes at the expense of the exclusion and marginalization in the United States of blacks and liberals, of the banditos in Brazil, as Bolsonaro likes to call everyone who is not a supporter of his, and then of course of Muslims and urban Naxalites in the Indian context. And regimes that are built on a politics of exclusion are not particularly good at delivering public goods, almost by definition. The second dimension is the hostility towards civil society. And this becomes deeply problematic in a crisis like this, because all of the responses that are required, again, both in addressing the pandemic and its welfare consequences, require co-production. I mean, there's very few things the state can do by itself without inviting the cooperation and the support of civil society actors. So the hostility that one sees in these autocratic regimes towards civil society makes that kind of co-production very difficult in a purely instrumental sense. But in a broader sense, it also undermines trust. In a pandemic like this, the key, of course, is eliciting compliance, getting citizens to behave in new ways that sometimes are uncomfortable and certainly inconvenient, and that can come at great personal expense during lockdowns, for example. And yet, across the world, we see many instances where compliance has been very high, where people wear masks, where people more or less follow the rules, where people are willing to share information for contact tracers where necessary. Whereas in Brazil and in the United States in particular, and I won't speak to this point in India because I think it's a little bit more complicated, but in Brazil and India, it's very clear that all of the necessary compliant behavior has been deeply politicized because of the politics of Trump and Bolsonaro, mocking the pandemic as a, quote, little flu, mocking those who wear masks as being less than virile, less than real men. And it's been very difficult to elicit compliance from Americans. So even though red state governors now do call for citizens to wear masks, in red states, this is a huge problem. Whereas here in the great state of Rhode Island, population 1 million, I can tell you that mask wearing is absolutely universal and it's not controversial. And we don't have these viral videos of people getting into shouting matches and fights over wearing masks. So these autocratic rulers, in other words, have made something that should have been a fairly self-evident public health intervention, mask wearing, into an object of political contestation. Now, having said that, I do want to underscore that both in Brazil and in the United States, and of course in India, there have been countervailing forces, which in and of themselves tell us a lot about the dynamic nature of democracies. In the United States, the media has been relentless in its reporting and in exposing the failures of the response. The scientific community has been incredibly mobilized. By far and away, the most popular person today in the United States is Mr. Fauci. And some of you who've been following the news will know that as of last night, America's by far most popular institution, the National Basketball Association, is on strike, and they're basically striking over the attempted murder of yet another young unarmed black male. But it's quite clear that they're also counter-programming the Republican convention. And this morning, James LeBron, who is probably the single most popular individual in the United States, was tweeting invectives against the president. The most important, of course, countervailing force in the United States has been the governors. We've had a running joke here in the United States that the largest opposition party in America is not the Democratic Party, it's the state of California. And throughout the Trump period, blue states that are governed by Democratic legislatures and Democratic governors, have essentially tried to preserve their own policies. And in the COVID crisis, they have followed their own policies. And the Cuomos and the Whitakers and the other governors have stood up to the president and have done all the things that haven't been done at the federal level, without the support, though, of federal resources. So there's a very sharp distinction in the United States between blue states and red states. And it's interesting here to note that this distinction isn't just one of contemporary political partisanship, it's also a distinction of the history of local governance. So in the states that have responded relatively well, the New England states in particular, local government is quite strong. There's a long history going back to de Tocqueville and associationalism in America, but there's a long history of local government, of somewhat more participatory forms of governance. We see this very clearly in the state of Rhode Island, where the governor has worked with unions and civil society and universities, and it's been, a very coordinated response across state agencies and civil society organizations. Whereas in many red states, the Mississippis and the Floridas and the Texases come to mind, there are, of course, the legacies of Jim Crow. There are the legacies of race-based exclusion. And what we've seen, of course, is the governors in red states take very ideological positions, going so far as to prohibit local governments from actually requiring people to wear masks. So the contrast there is quite striking. So now let me turn, and I realize I am short on time, and I will make these remarks fairly quick. But here I'm underlying many of the themes that Thomas Isaac already addressed, and themes that will be explored throughout this workshop. But I just want to give it a slightly different twist. I want to talk about, we often talk about deepening democracy. Everyone qualifies democracy, and this really does follow up on the comments that Thomas Isaac made. I think the democracies that have been the most successful in dealing with the pandemic, and that will continue to be successful in dealing with the welfare consequences of the pandemic, are democracies that I call embedded democracy. So what do I mean by embedded democracy? And the term, of course, comes from Polanyi, the idea of re-embedding the market in society. But I think we also need to be talking about the idea of embedding democratic states in civil society, in societies themselves. And embeddedness takes three specific forms. One is embedding actual public authority. That is, the state at the center with its constitution and its rational legal organizations, et cetera, represents the rule of law and public authority, et cetera. But oftentimes that authority really doesn't get far beyond the space of the capital or where those state agencies are located. Guillermo O'Donnell, the great Latin American political theorist, once argued that democratization is really about spreading public legality and authority throughout society. So that the public authority and legality penetrates into all the spaces of society. Or as Thomas Isaac put it, creating local democratic spaces, right? So it's not just the center that's democratic, but democratic practices and institutions are now penetrating throughout society. And that in turn, and this is the second point, sets up local spaces for deliberation with all the advantages that come from deliberation. and then is also associated with building up local institutional capacity. And here I just want to underscore the comparative point that Thomas Isaac made earlier about participatory budgeting in Latin America and the People's Campaign in Kerala. I agree entirely with him that there's a big difference. And the big difference is that the process of decentralization in Kerala hasn't just been a once-off process of mobilizing people and having participatory budgets. It's been a process of state building at the local level, right? Of building strong institutional and participatory capacity at the local level. And this, of course, has given Kerala both the institutional, but also I think the political resources to deal, at least in comparative terms by Indian standards, successfully with the COVID crisis. So let me turn to my last set of points, and I will finish in 5 minutes, Mr. Chair.
Oh, God.
Fast. I'm sorry. So in thinking about the relative success of Kerala within the Indian context, or the success of Northern European social democracies in Europe, or the blue states in the United States, I think there's really 3 elements that have to be emphasized. And I highlight these because I think these will be the subject of much discussion over the next few days. So the first, of course, is state capacity itself. And the chain of command. And state capacity in this context begins with having a public health care system, right? And there the correlations are really obvious. To this day in the United States, many people won't get tested because they're afraid of the cost of the test, and they're afraid that if they're hospitalized and they don't have insurance, they'll go bankrupt, which is absolutely extraordinary. Even Brazil doesn't have this problem. So having a public health care system in place makes a huge difference. If ever we needed a proof of the importance of state capacity, certainly the proof is now with us. Having said that, state capacity is also about coordination. And I think, whether it's in Kerala and the work of the chief minister and the coordination at the state level, or I see it in Rhode Island, the role of the governor in bringing different agencies together, that executive function of coordinating across agencies is absolutely critical, something the autocrats have not been good at. The last 2 points are about, again, decentralization and citizenship and trust. On decentralization, and again, remarks to this effect have already been made, but I really do want to emphasize that your response to the pandemic is only as good as the last link in the chain. You can have good procedures, you can have good people, you can mobilize a lot of resources, but at the end of the day, it's about the nurses, it's about the local policemen, it's about the frontline workers. And local government is critical there as a point of coordination, as this nodal point of intervention, but also because it's through local government that you can mobilize and incentivize frontline workers and give frontline workers the problem-solving autonomy they need to get the job done. Yet in most bureaucratic dispensations, of course, the logic is controlling frontline workers rather than giving them the autonomy of decision-making. And this is where decentralization becomes so important. The final point I want to make to underscore one of the elements of success of embedded democracy in dealing with the COVID crisis is this idea of trust and social capital. And again, I've said this before, but I think we all understand that eliciting compliance is absolutely critical, that if people aren't willing to alter behaviors, aren't willing to subscribe to certain public health practices, et cetera, dealing with the pandemic is going to be absolutely impossible. And this is where mobilizing civil society, having built strong democratic responsive institutions, breeds trust, which in turn increases the capacity of states, national states, subnational and local states to mobilize civil society resources and to invite and incentivize compliance. So let me just finish again by thanking all of you for this extraordinary opportunity. I'm looking forward not only to this workshop, but to thinking out loud together collectively about research opportunities. I think there's much to be learned through careful comparisons across countries and within countries, and hopefully this will be a first step in that direction. Thank you very much.
Patrick,
Thank you.
great as always.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Heller, for your critical analysis of the global scenario And you very beautifully illustrated how different regimes handled the crisis. The autocratic regimes, democratic regimes, welfare states, very, very fantastic critical analysis. You touched upon a large number of countries. You have a lot of questions, actually, Keller. I mean, I'm going to ask them to send you email. Probably you can interact with them. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you all. We come to the conclusion of the inaugural session. We are directly moving into the technical session 1. It is for today and tomorrow, but now we start with the decentralized governance and development in comparative perspective. This will be chaired by Professor Ole Ternquist, Professor of Political Science and Development Research, University of Oslo, and Mrs. Sharda Muralidharan IAS, the Principal Secretary of the Department of Local Self-Governments, Kerala, and Mr. Ahmad Tariq Rashid from the IDRC, Canada, will speak. Now, over to Professor Ternquist to chair the session. Professor.
Thank you very much. We are 10 minutes late or something. I wonder, are we going to be able to extend the session a little bit, or do we have to compress?
Can we extend it by a few minutes, 15 minutes?
I think that is the best way, yes.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, sure.
Is that okay, Joy?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's lovely to be there. I'm not in Oslo. I'm in Sweden. Swedes are deemed dangerous in Norway during the corona period. We'll come to that tomorrow. Without further ado, I'm happy to give the floor to Principal Secretary in the Department of Local Self-Government, Sharda Muralidharan, if I now pronounced it reasonably. And it's so good to know that she's going to talk about Cooperativism, because one of the weaker point of the experiments and campaigns was group farming, and Cooperativism was a breakthrough. So please tell us about it.
Thank you. Thank you, Ole. I'll come right in because we don't have too much of time. So I am expressing the views of a bureaucrat in a sea of academics, so you must forgive me if I sound reflective and also very focused on the administrative aspects of things. First of all, of course, Cooperativism, for those who don't know, is a humongous, and when I say humongous, it's a gigantic program which covers over 60% of the families of Kerala through its women. And these are the poorer section of society that come into Cooperativism. My presentation has 3 parts, which deals with the origins, second with the challenges of institutionalization and the questions that it posed, and then with how we've been looking at addressing those challenges. So going into origins straight away. Now, first of all, there already was a strong SHG network and movement happening in India at the time. But the unique thing about Cooperativism was the transformation of the notion of the self-help group, which was just a microfinance entity of women, into that of a neighborhood group, which was a subset of the Gram Sabha, that is the People's Assembly, which went into the People's Plan campaign. So this was a space that was created in round 1 of the People's Plan campaign, when it was noticed that the women were not coming into the Gram Sabhas. And so the idea of the self-help group was loaded on to the idea of creating communities of women who would become the voice of women in the Gram Sabhas. So this was about basically about combining the virtue of responsible credit behavior with participation in local governance processes. There was also another agenda, because in the early days of decentralization, there was this big counter campaign going on, which was that decentralization of governance was decentralization of corruption. And there was a popular perception that women were immune to corruption. And so roping in women was to reduce those allegations of local level corruption. Now, how does Kudumbashree function within the template of local governance? Structural connect there. So first of all, there is the elected member connect with the community organization. So Kudumbashree starts off with the neighborhood group. It is federated at the ward level of the local government into what's known as an area development society, and it's federated further at the local government level, that is in the village panchayat, in the municipality and municipal corporation, into what is known as the CDS. So this is a community development society, and it's an all-woman structure, and it is all poor women as well. So it's an interesting way in which relations develop between very powerful, very enabled local government structure, which is also politically very powerful, that comes in and connects with the community structure, which is that of poor women who till now perhaps had no voice whatsoever. So the structural connect that came in between local governments and Kudumbashree was, first of all, in this entire hierarchy, you had the elected member coming in either as patron or as member. And there was also a perception that women members needed to come in, because as members of the Kudumbashree at its panchayat level itself, because this would also help the women develop a political constituency and space that would then reflect in their working in the local government itself. The second connect is that of the planning, which was about civic community presence in planning committees and structures. And so you needed community, and you had Kudumbashree. You needed women, and you had Kudumbashree. So it was a space of women and community in the local governance planning structures. The third was the connect with the village assemblies, the Gram Sabha. And there it was bringing local communities in and involving them, as Dr. Isaac had mentioned earlier, in decision-making processes. And the most critical decision-making that was happening in the Gram Sabhas was that of identification of people who were going to be the beneficiaries, quote unquote, of various programs that were that were created. They had a role already in the planning committees of deciding what those programs would be. And the fourth connect, which I would like to talk about, is the execution connect, which was that the community development societies, the CDS, were actually brought in as agencies of local government to execute small works and to become the beneficiary committees that would take this on. So how did this space translate for Kudumbashree? Beneficiary selection in the Gram Sabhas, framing and executing women component plans, farming and micro enterprise activities, development coming into local markets in a big way, and then also moving on into destitute rehabilitation, working with physically and mentally handicapped children, looking at local sanitation and health campaigns, working with skilling programs, the humongous wage employment program of India, the MGNREGS. This is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which was a rights-based right to work scheme. So coming in and holding that up. So these are just some of the activities that Kudumbashree has now been, as an embedded community network in the local government, been responsible for. And what all this meant also was that 5 years down the line, when local governments, when political parties started hunting for women candidates to fill their reserved seats, the Kudumbashree network became a feeder organization of enabled and politics savvy women leadership to become local government women candidates. And this was cutting across political party lines. Stop there, move on to institutionalization and questions. And this is where it becomes a bit difficult. So the growth of Kudumbashree under the watch of local governments also brought along with it allegations of co-option of the network by party and local government leadership. So the CDS in many cases was seen as the approvers and also developing the clientelism, which was talked about earlier. Another problem that seemed to be coming out was the fact that while Kudumbashree was officially at the mission level, because you had a mission and you had a community structure, the mission which was supporting the community structure as part of a government program. And the mission was actually named the State Poverty Eradication Mission. So that was its mandate. And the big problem that came forward was the fact that people on the margins were being excluded. So the challenge also was, how do you look at the freedom and autonomy of the community federation without compromising the local government connect on the one hand? And also, how do you inculcate empathy and responsibility of the community network to outliers, to the marginalized, leading to their inclusion and also prioritization in the work of the communities? So as a communitized execution arm of the local governments, also we had problems because it was easy to offload work onto the Kudumbashree network, seeing that they were women, they would not be corrupt, but it also meant that they were taking on more than they were capable of. There was a risk of becoming proxies, and the challenge there was how do you strengthen the administrative and executive capability of this organization? How do you free them from areas of work outside the scope? How do you basically ensure that that they do not become the fall guy for corruption because of their vulnerability in the power equations that were happening locally? That is basically, how could they escape rural elite capture working in a structure of this nature? So the community network itself, when it became so big and became representative of such a gigantic chunk of the population, itself was in danger of developing into a local power center in its own right. So there was consolidation, there could be favoritism, they would be seen by the local governments themselves as alternate power centers. A common refrain was, Kudumbashree thinks that it's a panchayat, we are the elected members, not them. Who do they think they are? So the challenge was, again, for us, perhaps that we needed to bring in a democratization of the community structure itself, that the community leadership had to be continually reminded of its accountability to its core constituency, and that there had to be clarity on the role of community and the role of local government. And the politics of engagement had to be very, very clearly noted down. There is, of course, also the development questions, and which was posed earlier also by Dr. Isaac about local economic development in the productive sector. How do local governments do that? What is the way that they could work again with local communities? What are the workable models of small-scale entrepreneurship? Can scale and end-to-end solutions be actually developed completely within a local governance framework? And of course, there was this big gender question. The workforce participation of poor women, extremely poor. How do you improve the terms of engagement in favor of women? How to touch on the issues of gender disparities in both private and public spaces, which affect the way they actually work in the spaces that are created, for the institutional spaces that are created for them. And most important of all, how do they navigate power structures, and that too within the framework of a collaborative government program? Finally comes the participation question, because when is it that participation becomes voice and agency? Because we have, and governments would like to be paternalistic towards Kudumbashree. They really don't want voice, whereas in the local government, but it is only when you develop voice and agency that you are actually in a position to deliver informed local decision making and contribute to the social capital that would hold local governance in good stead. So in the search for solutions, Kudumbashree restructured its bylaws to bring in role clarity between local governments and the network. It democratized its community structures by creating a system of elections, and these have been institutionalized now in Kudumbashree. There's been an intense focus on capacity building, training. And this was a training that focused on respect and focused on rights. And it was about throwing light on rights of communities and how they could access them and how they could avail and claim those rights. So it also meant, therefore, developing confidence and self-worth and breaking stereotypes, and for which Kudumbashree, looking to the experience of the People's Plan campaign, also on its own developed its own army of resource persons for gender, for child rights, for entrepreneurship, for farming, for training, for social inclusion, for management and accounting, for just the bricks and mortar part of the work as well. And the mission, the Kudumbashree mission, which was the state organ, led a facilitation of value chain projects for local government and connecting the local government with the Kudumbashree network and creating, in a sense, a need of local governments to associate with the community organizations and a need to respect the autonomy of the local community organizations. So these were very interesting experiments that Kudumbashree had to develop. And this was about protection against the agencyfication of the network, and which was where the mission came in as a bridge or buffer between the local governments and the community. So just to bring everything cut to the chase, finally, for me, as someone who's been associated with Kudumbashree for a good chunk of 6 to 10 years or more, is that the story of Kudumbashree is actually a story of a journey towards realizing citizenship. And it's also a rather ironic story because this citizenship is something which is being encouraged and nourished within a government program. And there are miles to go before Kudumbashree mission can sleep.
Okay. Thank you so much for your intervention. Now time is short, so we'll have to save questions and discussions for the final round. So let us now turn to the Bangladesh experience and ask Ahmed Tariq Rashid to discuss the combination of various organizations and the state in the maternal and child sector, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me, everybody?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Ole, and thank you, Joe, for inviting me to this very interesting webinar. For time's sake, I will just be very quick, but before I do so, just a couple of caveats. In the program description, my affiliation was given as International Development Research Center. I do not work for IDRC anymore. So I just wanted to clarify that. And the second caveat is that in the title of my talk, there's a question mark, so which was missing. So roles of NGO states for profit for improving maternal child health in Bangladesh towards the division of labor question mark. So I'm just kind of like posing a question as opposed to having a definitive answer. So we'll have to like keep that in mind as I move along. So I'm just gonna like not dive into the empirical side of things, and this is a kind of a superficial endeavor at this stage. But basically, I just want to like focus on three things. First, I just want to pose a question in terms of what some people have said, impressive human development gains in Bangladesh. Second, I just want to touch on like what could be the factors behind it. And third, I just want to bring in examples from the maternal and child health sector to demonstrate or illustrate my point here. So first, like in terms of human development, Bangladesh has achieved some success by most accounts. If you look at some of the indicators, I'm just going to throw out a couple here. Life expectancy at birth increased 14 years in the last 2 decades. Mean years of schooling, which is one of the key indicators in the UNDP's HDI, has increased by 3.5 years. Expected years of schooling has increased by almost 6 years. So when we say success, we do need to take it with a grain of salt. There are numerous problems in both the public health and education sector in Bangladesh, which I will not get into. but it seems that some things have worked in terms of human development in Bangladesh, particularly in health. So the question becomes like, what has been the driving factors? Who were the key actors behind that success, quote and unquote success? Now, I draw a lot from Amartya Sen's, the Indian economist, when it comes to human development, and of course, like UNDP's seminal work earlier. And when they talk about human development, they kind of like, particularly Sen, he talks about two ways that, states can and bring positive change in human development. One is what he calls like income-based approach, where you have sustained economic growth, and which translates and it has an impact positively on some of the social elements and what he calls like capabilities, increasing people's capabilities in doing so and having the choice to be able to do so. The second approach he mentions is a more support-led. So by that he means that increased investment in those sectors will lead to better outcomes. So, for example, if a state invests more in health and education, you will probably see a result in that. Now, here's where it falls apart in kind of Bangladesh terms. The overall macroeconomic growth has been steady. It hasn't been that strong, so it's hovering around 6% in the last 10 years or so. So we don't necessarily think that it is that driving force behind what has been achievements in human development. Secondly, if you look at the annual budgets in terms of GDP that is dedicated to health and public sectors, for example, health and education, it is particularly low. So it is hovering around 2% for health in the last, and in fact going behind 2% in some years. So that is extremely low even for like South Asian standards and let alone the development states levels. So here we have a paradox. We have kind of like good success in some areas in social infrastructure and social development, but those kind of like other elements that are needed to happen has happened. So we have what some analysts have called the Bangladesh paradox. What is behind it? Now, here is where I bring the example of health and particularly maternal child health to zero in on to illustrate my kind of argument. And it is not necessarily my argument, like other people have already proposed this idea. There are two ideas here I want to put forward. Number one, it has not been a particular actor driving that change. Rather, it has been an approach that is based on pluralism in terms of actors. So in other words, states had a strong role, NGOs have come in, and to a lesser extent, the private sector has evolved and flourished and have provided some much needed support to cater for the needs of public. So that's the first kind of like overarching thesis that I want to put forward. The second related to that is that changes has happened, but it has been very slow, organic, and often based on small innovations that cuts across these different sectors and very much interrelated with each other. By which I mean is that, for example, underlying everything that has happened in the health sector, in the education sector, has had to do with other underlying factors such as empowerment of women. So it has been incremental in that sense, incremental and organic in the sense that we have had NGOs coming in with social enterprise models that has contributed to income, which had an impact on awareness. We had incremental and feedback loops happening with education and health. Women's education has improved, and which has an impact on their health. Awareness has increased. So that is my overall idea. And I just want to like quickly touch base on talk a little bit about the maternal child health issue. And even though it is a relatively small percentage of the health sector, but nevertheless, it's an important one when it comes to human development and overall development of the country. Now, the health sector, I should mention, like we're talking about success, but health sector has a significant problem. Like we have one of the highest, Bangladesh has one of the highest out-of-pocket expenses, nearly 70% expenses come from out-of-pocket of patients. So there's severe problems. The government has significant challenges, and we discussed, several speakers have talked about COVID. When it comes to a crisis, we see what a poor health system is all about. And that has been clear in Bangladesh case as well. But beside that point, if we look at that, if we look at the maternal child health, what has happened in the last, let's say, 20 years? So I'm going to focus on, like, because my presentation is mainly about actors, I'm going to focus on the three actors that I spoke about. First is the state. The second is the NGOs. Actually, sorry, in reverse order. Like the first is the NGOs, the second the state, and the third the private sector. Now, NGOs has been, as most of you will know, and examples in Kerala is also quite illustrative in that, has played a very big part in Bangladesh's success. There's no kind of like arguing that point, and I'm not gonna like question that either. What I'm gonna say though is that yes, NGOs had huge success and had a big role to play in Bangladesh's development in the last 20 years, but it doesn't tell the whole story. So I'll talk about BRAC, which is one of the largest NGOs, not just in Bangladesh, in the world, and what they have done, but how they have gone about it. So in terms of maternal child health, one of the key things that has happened in the country is the community health workers. Now there are around, like, as far as the latest statistics go, around 200,000 community health workers. Now these include volunteers and paid workers. They're mainly like generally heterogeneous group of women who go door to door, provide essential services and awareness about family planning, awareness about child nutrition, awareness about pregnancy-related care. And they are also able to refer patients when, let's say, for example, there's a need for C-section surgeries. Now, of the 200,000 or so community health workers in Bangladesh, which is comparatively speaking, since we are comparing in our previous talks as well, is more than other similar countries of similar level in South Asia, as far as I have seen. Now, they play an important role because primary healthcare in the rural areas, it's in remote areas has been a problem, and this is where the decentralization part of it is important to bring in. The local government structure has not been as strong as it could have been through at least the bureaucratic ways of when you're in terms of service delivery. And out of the 200,000. Half or more than half is actually BRACs, what we call Shastro Shebikas in Bangla, basically health providers, if I were to translate the term. Now, it is interesting how BRAC, when it delivers a program, how it thinks of sustainability, and other scholars have talked about it. But one of the interesting things that they do is that when they go door to door, they also sell products as a way of income. Because if you recall, like some of them, in fact, the majority of them are on a work on a voluntary basis. So that is an interesting way of social enterprise-based approach, where you're delivering a service, but at the same time addressing the sustainability issues that has often led to many programs being a failure and not being sustainable in the long run. So that's an example of the NGO side of things. If we go to the public sector, what has happened? And I'm going to draw on the example of immunization in the country. So in the 80s, immunization rate in Bangladesh and under 5 immunization has been very low, but it has now 2015 statistics show that it has reached more than 90% in the country. So by all accounts, it has been a success. What has been driving that success? Now, first of all, a lot of credit is due to the government in the state, in this case, because there was a commitment, and it is a international and global commitment, but nevertheless, it needs to translate to that local level. And that has happened in Bangladesh. The government put as a priority that and there are 2 important ways that it has done so. One is massive awareness campaigns that has happened in the country and even to the rural, remotest areas about immunization, child immunization. Now, the other main mode of operation was that they have divided, and that's where my division of labor argument comes in. They have divided and ruled that area, because one of the things that they did is that in urban areas, they're working with NGOs to deliver that. You would think that, it's relatively easy thing in delivering immunization. You get the supplies. It is not, in reality, it is quite a complex endeavor, technically and delivering to people. So by all accounts, diphtheria, tetanus, polio, Bangladesh has been declared a polio-free country recently. So all this have happened in a kind of innovative way where the state recognized that it has not the full capacity to be able to deliver this, and we need to engage with others, partners, in order to do what is required to do. In other words, reach the people. And in some cases, what the NGOs bring in is the poverty focus. If you recall the BRAC's case, I'm going back to the BRAC example. BRAC has been one of the pioneers in working with the poor people and actually targeting who are the actual poor and where the support needs to go and what the support needs to be. So for just a quick example, they basically said that microcredit will not work in some cases. So we will give them cows because that they can build on that. So those kind of innovations have happened. Now, finally, I think I'm running out of time.
2 minutes.
Finally, 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Olet. And finally, I just want to bring in like the example of the private sector, not to the extent of the other 2 actors, because what has happened is that, because of the poor public health, private sector mushroomed. Now we have around 16,000 private facilities, including diagnostic centers, that has been spread all over the country. And they do serve an important purpose in terms of people who are having the ability to pay to access services. Now, income has also gone a little bit more people out of poverty. So that has had a say in people more accessing. Now, there are huge issues with the private sector. There's been just to give an example on maternal and child health, the C-section surgeries is astoundingly high. And you have the profit motive there driving those. It's nearly 60%, where WHO says that it should be around 30%. So anyway, there are problems, but my point is that private sector did play a part in fulfilling the demand of particular segment of the population, and even in rural areas. So that's my kind of illustrative, although admittedly supportive case studies of the sector for maternal and child health. So I'm going to conclude by going back to the thing I have argued at the beginning, is that John Martin Newson, who kind of argued that, in his book, that, it is not a matter of state versus society, or public versus private. Rather, it is maybe as a matter of division of labor. And I think in this case, that argument actually holds true, because the examples that I cited had all the different actors having a role. Immunization, the NGOs played a role. And when it comes to NGOs, there is a strong linkage between what BRAC community health workers do and the public health system, because they were at the end of the day referring them to the public hospitals, and in fact facilitating the fact that, you know, if an expectant mother needs a surgery, how can we ensure that this woman is reaching a public hospital? So that kind of division of labor has happened. So I'll end there, and the final comment is that, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we are short of time.
Sorry.
Now we have run out of time, but I understand that we can extend the session a little bit and allow for some comments and questions. I thought that we could use this chat function, and then we could summarize it, and the speakers could collect and return with a final comment. Let me start with one question to the both of you, perhaps particularly in the Kerala context. But anyway, there is going to be a great need during and after the COVID for public works, for people to actually survive, not just in Kerala, of course, but also in other places around the globe with unemployment and cut downs and so on. Do your experiences from the Kutumbashraya and from the coordination in Bangladesh has anything to say about the capacity to arrange this on the local level through these groups? That's my question. Then there have been questions from Gopal about cooperativism. It comes up, he says, during these emergency cases, but why does it come down? Have you any comments on that? And also the question about the information system. If I understand it correctly, we have a problem of incomplete information system. So we should have comments on that. We have also a question about what we mean by democracy, but Errol, I wonder whether we can take it up here. Could we perhaps return to that a little bit later in the session? But anyway, those are the questions that have come up now. Are there any others, or shall we allow our speakers to comment on them? Any more questions? Please raise your hand or speak up now. I don't hear anyone, so or see anyone. So could we ask Sarada to return very briefly and address those issues, and then we turn to.
Yes, thank you. With regard to COVID response, the community network now, I could speak both about the local governments and the community network since I'm associated with both. There has been a lot going on. The government itself has come up with a plan. Kerala has been seen as a consumer, presuming that we will be having days of food insecurity ahead. There has been a very concerted attempt at consolidating resources. The food insecurity, because there's also a lot of in-migration of people who've lost their jobs, who come into Kerala, and people who've inside Kerala who have being hit by economic depression. So there is an attempt at local consolidation. We've been looking at bringing in farm activities, non-farm activities, developing local markets, converging programs, and working on that. The Kutumbashraya network itself has been channelizing a lot of funds from the state government. So 2,000 crore rupees has already been dispersed, and interestingly, there's also been a chitti, in which because schools now are closed and students are learning online, So there's been a credit program by which women are able to get laptops for their children. So that kind of intervention is also going on. The Kooperativism network has been extremely important in, on the ground as frontline workers. They've been associated with identifying and supporting the people who we regard as high risk, the senior citizens, people with comorbidities, identifying them, counseling them. They've also been involved with community counseling because we've had massive depression, coming out in times of COVID and the lockdown. So they've been trained, and they have also been going out into the community. They themselves have developed their own virtual platforms in which they can work things through. And they have now, be it fishing, so fish farming in public ponds, for instance. The Kooperativism network is mobilizing itself and claiming to get lease on public ponds so that they can take this forward. So you have a whole host of interventions that are coming in that context.
What about the issue of which was raised by who was it? Sorry.
Yeah.
Anyway, about the cooperativism and the ups and downs of cooperativism.
And that is only to be expected because and in a usual natural disaster, your response is limited to a very small period. There's been a fatigue which has been hitting not just cooperativism, but the entire network itself. Kerala has been grappling with COVID from the 1st of February onwards, end of January onwards. So it's been we've had about 3 waves of COVID coming in, and we managed to successfully handle the first 2, but then this just isn't getting over, and there is fatigue sitting in. We've seen that people also tire out, and there is sometimes paranoia that develops with regard to participation, because the more, on the one hand, you also become apathetic to the situation, but on the other hand, you become fairly paranoid about yourselves and protecting yourselves. So now we are looking at saying there's this program for disaster management which had been launched, which says Nammal Namukai. Basically, it means it's we for ourselves, and that's a campaign in which we're trying to push the idea of like it's about us. It's now or never. We just can't afford to give up hope, and we're consolidating. Yep. So yes, it's something to be expected, but we just work through multiple campaigns and new strategies to re-energize and keep on re-energizing cooperative endeavors.
Okay, thank you very much. So much to talk about, but we'll have to cut it there, I think. And then, Ahmed, do you have any final comments on these issues?
Sure, Ole. I just want to pick on like that one point Gopal raised about inequality. So in the Bangladesh case, I'll just cite an example of the garments industry, because as you know, the garment sector has been like the major GDP income source for the country. But if we go down to the actual local level, it's the women who was the majority workers in the garment sector have been impacted. Day laborers who live literally on a day-to-day, they have been the one impacted because the work has been impacted. Now, the Garments Association have been unable to and often it's a difficult decision whether to close down the garments factories, because on the one hand, there is a risk of further infections. On the other hand, you are basically taking away income of millions of women, and not just that, and their household income depends on typically the workers of garments factories. So here's an example where it is having a huge impact. So I just think that not getting into what the interventions have been, I just think that this is something when you have again bringing it to the poor labor laws and labor rights. If you don't have that kind of institutional mechanisms this crisis has a significant impact on those who live at the bottom of the pyramid.
Yeah, thank you so much. I presume we should really round up now, and thanks everyone for your patience. I have enjoyed this lot. And Errol, I think perhaps, if not before, so when we turn to the session 5 on concepts and visions, we should remember your intervention there on what we really mean with democracy here. But we'll probably have to save it for that. Thank you for me. Is there anyone from the organizer who wants to round up and say something for tomorrow?
Yes. First of all, let us thank you first, Professor Turnquist, for chairing this session, moderating it so well. And then thanks to Sharada Madam for highlighting the evolution, the story of Kudumbashree, and Dr. Ahmad Tariq Rashid, who talked about the various actors in Bangladesh. Thank you all, and thank you all who have watched this program. Tomorrow, we start exactly at 7 p.m. Indian time, IST, and we will continue with this session, Decentralized Governance and Development in Comparative Perspective. Professor Jeevan Kumar will chair the session, where again we have Professor Turnquist talking about comparative notes on the pros and cons of decentralization in view of the corona. We have Stephen Friedman from Faculty of Humanities, University of Johannesburg. The cure remains a symptom, subnational government, democracy and development in South Africa. Then Professor Ken Harilal from the Center for Development Studies, Kerala, and also the member Kerala State Planning Board on democratic decentralization Kerala, a critique of recent experience. Professor Sanal Mohan from the Mahatma Gandhi University will be talking about citizenship and social sufferings in the context of COVID-19. And Professor Sunil Ray will be talking about employment creation at decentralized level through construction of niche structure and promotion of self-organization. So tomorrow, Indian time, 7 p.m., we start the session, the second day of this international webinar on cooperativism, self-management and decentralized development, jointly organized by Mahatma Gandhi University and ILA. Thank you all. Thank you all. We are closing the program for the day.